This is the Grow My Clinic podcast by Clinic Mastery, where we help you deliver amazing client experiences to grow your clinic.
Well, welcome back to another episode of the Grow Your Clinic podcast. My name is Jack O'Brien, your host. Thank you so much again for joining us for another episode. We really appreciate you trusting us with your time and your earbuds. And today we have another guest on the show for you, and this has been a long time coming. A real inspiration to me, and I'm so stoked to welcome Jason Smith to the podcast. How are you, Jason?
Very good, Jack. Thanks for having me on. I hope I don't disappoint you if it's been long overdue.
No, that'll be impossible, mate. For those who have been living under a rock for the past decade or so and aren't familiar with Jason, Jason's the founder and group director of the Back in Motion Health Group, physiotherapy clinics right across at least the southeastern corner of Australia and across the ditch and all sorts of places. Jason, for those who are unfamiliar, can you fill us in on the backstory, how you got into physio, and then how you ended up running a clinic and then a group of clinics?
Yeah, well, it's there's always a long version and a short version to that story, Jack. I'll try and give you the short version. When I was 10 years of age, had one of the most defining moments of my life where I decided that I wanted to be in healthcare, and I particularly wanted to be a doctor, a nurse, or a physio to go work in the developing world. You might want to learn more about that in a minute, but that was a trajectory that got set way back when I was 10. And as it happened, I became a physio, worked in the public health system for a number of years until I realised it wasn't really floating my boat. My wife and I had travelled pretty broadly in our early 20s across the world to try and find some volunteer projects to work in, and they all were fulfilling, but weren't sustainable. They were all volunteer-driven projects, and so we came back home. We started a small practice in the garage. In fact, it's only a carport in a small little suburb in Melbourne. And as they say, the rest was history. And so within about 2 or 3 years of doing that, we had one of the largest practices in the country, which then spawned a network of practices that today have over 100 locations, Australia and New Zealand.
It's really impressive, mate. Thank you for sharing. And without bringing the focus back onto myself, it really resonates. I had exactly the same epiphany when I was 15 or 16. I want to be in healthcare across the globe in a humanitarian play in some regard. So I think that's really exciting. And I think so many clinic owners have gone through a situation of getting frustrated or burnt out, whether with the public system or practice they're working in, starting something in the backyard. And, you know, you've been able to multiply that across 100 plus clinics, which is really exciting. For a little bit more insight into who you are personally, a couple of rapid fire questions we've added to the podcast of late. Jason, what are you reading right now?
I'm always reading the Bible. The second book I'm reading at the moment is a book called Me, Myself and Bob, written by Phil Vischer. Your audience might not be familiar with this guy, but he's a big name in children's television, and he started a massive organisation who are the creators of Veggie Tales. Now, you might know about this, Jack, if
very familiar.
Fella, but he tells a remarkable story of the big rise and then the big fall, where personal ambition gets the better of him. That's actually the second time I'm reading this book. And I find myself recommending it so often, I thought, man, it's probably time I reread it myself. Mm-hmm. And then the third book I'm reading is Trust in Business, written by Vanessa Hall. And I know Vanessa personally, so I have 3 books on the go, which is about normal for me, depending what mood I'm in.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I love books. I've got a goal to read 1 book a week this year, so 50 books. However, my previous guest on the podcast doesn't read at all.
Right.
It's really interesting. Just, chooses not to cloud his thoughts with other people's perspectives. So really interesting. So I really appreciate 3 books at a time. That's amazing. Yeah. Tell me, Jason, who do you look to as a mentor?
I think mentoring is a really special relationship. In fact, I think second only to your life partner, who you choose as your mentor would be the next most critical decision you make. And so I actually have a couple of mentors in different areas of life. One whom has now journeyed with me for nearly 20 years, and I'm very grateful for that. And another who's probably coming on 10 years. Both are very senior to me in terms of chronology. I look for grey hair or no hair, and that just means they've lived a few laps of the block. And I rely on both of those two men for quite a range of inputs into my life. They wouldn't be known publicly, but personally, they are a huge support to me.
I love that. What about holidays, mate? What's your most memorable recent holiday experience?
Well, somebody said to me many years ago that you always need to have your next holiday booked if you want to stay sane. And so I think my wife took that almost as gospel, and it's now a religion in our family. So we always have the next holiday booked. We literally just got off a plane 2 days ago coming back from Hamilton Island, which was wonderful. But we also went to Ayers Rock earlier this year, which was great. My all-time favourite holiday was a trip around Australia. We bought a combi van, and my wife and I, pre-kids, just toured the country, and it's a beautiful country. And in fact, in about 30 days, we're about to hike the foothills of the Himalayas in India, taking three of our four kids with us. We're doing some humanitarian projects over in India at the same time, but we figured why not stretch the legs around the foothills while we're there. So
that's awesome, mate. That's so cool. And just if we divert a little bit on some personal mindset stuff, I've found that we've had similar advice around always have the next holiday booked. Personally, we've made it a family ritual that when we're on a holiday, we book the next one while we're there. And there's actually a fascinating little mindset shift when you're on a holiday but you don't have the next one booked yet. There becomes this scarcity and like we better make the most of it because we don't know when the next one's coming. However, if you've got the future one booked, you can kick back, relax, enjoy the moment you're in, knowing that you've got another trip coming up. It's a subtle little shift, but it's made a massive difference to our enjoyment of our time away.
Absolutely.
That's awesome, mate. Thank you for sharing. Let's talk about Back in Motion, but specifically, I'm really interested in the leadership skills and your journey through that. So tell me, what have been some of the challenges as you've grown multi-practice, then multi-group, all these types of things? What's been some of the biggest challenges you've had to overcome?
I think, like probably what is true for most people, the real challenge in leading or starting a business, in operating a business, is rarely the numbers. It's rarely the work ethic. It's always the personal journey. It's the intense change that is demanded of you, the person, as you journey through the next stages of the evolution of your business. It is about leadership. It is about people. It is about teams. It's about staying true to your values and your convictions in the face of what is lots of opportunity to do the wrong thing. The temptation to cheat and steal and get one up on the next guy. I mean, that exists every day. And so I think really, to be honest, that the big journey, and my wife and I reflect on this often, the big journey of Back in Motion for us, and it's our 20th year this year, is just the huge personal growth that you go through. And it's got nothing to do with how many locations you have or how much money you make. And so for all your listeners out there, regardless how big or small their practice is, they need to embrace the personal journey. So for me, it's been one of leadership. And I know that word gets thrown around a lot. It's probably overused. And yet for me, I think it is the right word to describe what has been the great adventure. It's one of personal leadership.
Okay. And I know you've written an incredible book, which we'll touch on a little bit later, but in that book, you really described how you had to shift and turn the organisation on its head. What were some of the key lessons or learnings out of that experience for you?
Yeah. So I call it outside in, downside up leadership. The publisher really wanted me to call it upside down, inside out, because that's the phrase, that's the colloquialism, that's what rolls off the tongue. And I said to her, it just doesn't do the internal turmoil justice if it just sounds too easy. So we called it outside in, downside up, because it really did flip me on the head. The business and the organizational chart and the way we run our work processes through the Back in Motion Health Group has significantly changed in the last 6 years. But I have had to change significantly, as have the people who work with me. So I think getting rid of the ego in the workplace, bringing back creativity, they are leadership challenges and things that we've had to wrestle with. Making sure everybody feels valued, even though they make a different contribution. So we're not all the same, we're not all equal, but we need to bring fairness and equity back into the team. That's been a really important journey. courage, Jack. You need to
Right.
be courageous. And we were really courageous when we were young and dumb. And as we got older, we got fatter and slower in terms of how we made decisions and how we risked the farm in terms of wanting to make a difference in the world. And part of outside in, downside up leadership was going back to our roots, our entrepreneurial spirit, and just putting, betting everything on the house again and saying we need to be courageous. We need to back ourselves. So, there's some of the, I guess, high points, or as they might have felt at the time, low points of the leadership journey about 6 years ago when we started what we call the leadership revolution inside Back in Motion.
Okay. And on the book specifically, if people want to grab it, they can get it from Amazon and on your websites, which we'll be able to link up in our show notes later on. But you talk about empowering every person in the organisation from the top all the way down, and arguably those at, in inverted commas, lower levels of responsibility have as much say sometimes as those higher. What's been the outcome of that shift over the last, let's say, the last 2 or 3 years? How has that played out practically in the organisation?
Yeah, so we call the principle you're referring to there, we call it distributed authority, which is different to delegation or even just the broad idea of empowerment, although those words clearly have some connection. But distributed authority says we want to make everybody a CEO of something inside the organisation. So I don't carry that title because we're all CEOs. We're all responsible for something. And ideally that something is what you're good at and what you love doing.
Right.
And think about it. If you gave everybody in your practice the opportunity to do what they love and to do what they're great at, then they are the two secrets to a fulfilling role. And if you're fulfilled, then you are going to not only stay in the job, but you are going to press the boundaries of what you're good at and what you love doing, which means you're going to grow. Healthy things grow. This is one of the resolutions I have made in life.
Yeah.
Healthy things grow. Healthy children grow. Healthy plants grow. Healthy stock markets grow. And healthy teams will grow even if we measure growth in different ways. So in the last 2 or 3 years, because of that principle we call distributed authority, we have grown in terms of footprint, we have grown in terms of revenue, we have grown in terms of profitability, but most importantly, we have grown in terms of the richness of people feeling like they can connect in the way they build culture, in the way they add back to the team and the community around them. I think we've grown intrinsically as people, and so healthy things grow.
Yeah. 100%. I totally resonate with that. So I'm interested, what are some practical things that you do to instill health in the organisation? And also then in your personal life and leadership, what do you do to stay healthy as a leader?
So, health has to be looked at multidimensionally. Of course, most of us on the podcast today are health professionals, but I think we are horribly diluted in terms of how often we get framed in the way we consider health. So I've redefined health. In fact, it's another book that I've written, not to confuse your listeners. The first book I wrote was called Getting Yourself Back in Motion. And in that book, actually, in the first couple of chapters, I redefine health, not as being the absence of disease or sickness, but in fact, living at your best.
Sure.
But being optimal. So practically some of the ways we try and be healthy at work is we do have what we call free speech sessions where people get to say exactly what's on their mind. We coach them to be respectful. We coach them to say it to the right person at the right time in the right way. But you know what? To still speak it, because if you're thinking it, it's only a matter of time when you're going to act it. So you might as well say it. And then we can all be more aware of what it is that's running through your mind. We do, to stay healthy at work, we have walking meetings, stand-up meetings. You look like you're having a stand-up podcast right now. To stay healthy at work, we have what we call the fun pod, which is an opportunity to just enjoy each other's company in ways that have, a little less pressure, a little less stress than maybe all the big decision-making meetings. There are so many ways to stay healthy, but I guess for me personally, which was the other half of your question there, I sort of think of the dimensions of the physical, the spiritual, the emotional, the relational, and even the financial, because all of those things have an impact on health. I'll try and exercise 3 or 4 times a week. I'm not fanatical, but I want to keep moving. I want to keep active. I'll try and eat well 70% of the time. Again, I don't want to set a bar too high that I can't reach. Whole foods is a really good rule of thumb. Spiritually, I want to be connected to God every day. And for me, that I don't want that to be an event. I want that to be a lifestyle, a posture. So that involves lots of different expressions. But for me, that's a really important part of it. Financially, I want to spend less than I earn, and I want to give away as much as I can. And I don't want to wait until I have enough before I start giving. And I think that keeps me financially healthy. And then relationally, I'm a dad of 4 and a husband to 1. And that's a good ratio. And Absolutely. I want to make sure that I'm emotionally present at home. I mean, for years, Pauline and my wife used to say, I know you're physically here, but I'm not sure you're emotionally here. Right. And that's sort of the stress of running a practice or 100. And so I think it's a discipline to make sure that when I walk through the door at the end of the day, I turn my hat around and I change jobs and I'm emotionally present. So, there are a couple of things that I would think about regularly to stay healthy.
That's unreal, mate. I love it. And we could talk about those for hours and unpack those. If I can just segue off the financial health that you touched on there and not waiting until you've got enough to give. I know it's been a real expression of yours and Back in Motions to start a foundation. And it really resonates, I think, with our listeners around those who want to build a clinic for good, who want to build a clinic for more than just putting their kids through private school and lining their pockets, but want to give back and amplify their impact. So where did that all start for you? And tell us about your foundation, please.
Fantastic. I'm grateful for the question, Jack, because it strikes at the heart really of my wife and my purpose to be in business in the first place. So I often describe myself as an accidental CEO and a reluctant businessman. And if anybody has read anything about my story, they'd probably realize that there's lots of reasons why I introduced myself that way. I have really very little interest in business. Now, obviously, I've needed to learn the art of business, right? Because business creates opportunity, and opportunity, it invites people into our world and financial resources. But mostly, I'm interested in 2 things. One is I want us to live more healthy, and we've just spoken about health. Like, I want to empower people in optimal health. And secondly, we want to make a difference in the lives of disadvantaged people. They are really the 2 wings of the plane that keep us balanced in flight. So and, when I was 10, again, just to go back to that little story there, I was watching cartoons on a Saturday morning. The rest of the household was asleep. And in the 1980s, if anybody remembers it, between Roadrunner and Bugs Bunny, these images of starving children in Ethiopia flashed up on the screen. They were World Vision adverts, and it wrecked me. It completely disrupted my life. I couldn't understand how the parents weren't helping the kids. I couldn't work out why somebody wouldn't give them food. And I made a pledge. I made a little promise to God as a 10-year-old boy that whatever I did in life, I wanted to do it to help people who didn't have enough. And it's not meant to sound heroic, and it's not meant to sound cliche or glib. It just is. That as a 10-year-old, I have no other way of explaining it except that it changed my life. And my wife, who was born in Brazil, who is no stranger to the sight of poverty, has seen favelas, knows what it means to have little. When we met and connected, she had exactly the same life aspiration. Wow. So we only started Back in Motion because, frankly, it seemed like the most logical way to build a team of like-minded people who wanted to make a difference in the world. We wanted to build scale around an ethical business model that created more than enough for us so that we could give into the lives of others. And we've done that lots of different ways. And I want to credit our team and all of our franchisees because they have been generous beyond recognition. Many of them are the silent givers who just are so supportive of these sorts of programs and work, but they'll never be on a podcast telling their story. And yet they're often, the guys, the silent heroes behind the scenes. But all of that led 10 years ago to starting the SOS Health Foundation. Right. So that's your question. And SOS is an acronym that stands for success or significance, and it really drives at the heart of the question that we want to provoke in our industry, and that is, are you just running your businesses and leading your teams and treating patients to be successful, or do you want to be significant, which is make a difference in the lives of others?
That's unreal, mate. It's I'm sure that'll resonate so much that it's those things like having enough money and being wealthy and putting your kids through school and driving a nice car, they're in and of themselves not bad things, but we can do so much more. Yeah, we don't need to just settle for things like that. And I love that you touched on a little bit there, giving the franchisees and the team by and large the opportunity to contribute, not just by giving. I think sometimes we associate giving with the dollars, and if you don't have the dollars, then you can't give. I love that the SOS Foundation allows people to go and volunteer and contribute in other ways than just dollars. So what are some of the ways, or what are some of the things that the SOS Foundation does?
Yeah. So the SOS Health Foundation has 10 years of history, and we've done all sorts of projects along the way. And even before we had a foundation, our group was giving and continues to give overseas to hospitals who are without equipment, and we work amongst orphanages in Thailand, and we build safe houses for kids who need to be rescued from trafficking. And there's lots of expressions of giving and significance that our group has helped fund. But SOS very specifically is a domestic program, so it's only for Australia, and it's about supporting our Indigenous people, our First people. They're in my mind our brothers and sisters, regardless of the politics and regardless of all of the various views that society has. They're people in need, and we aren't here to judge. We're here to help. And so SOS runs two core projects at the moment. One is on Palm Island, which sounds idyllic. It sounds romantic. Palm Island is off the Townsville coast. It's one of Australia's largest Indigenous communities, and its poverty levels are on par with Bangladesh. It's considered fourth, and it's a postcode of Australia. And so we run a full-time allied health practice on that island. The other big project that we do is up in northeast Arnhem Land, where we service on a fly-in, fly-out basis 20 homeland communities every month with physio and podiatry and occupational therapy. And you're right, you can give in lots of different ways. We value the dollars because someone's got to pay Qantas to fly us up there.
Right.
But we love volunteers because give of your time and your skills, and that's one of the most, crucial contributions somebody could make. But, another really big way people can help or give is advocate for us, advocate for the cause, tell the story. We don't know when our next volunteer or dollar of sponsorship's coming from, but we just need people to tell our story. And so advocacy is a really big help.
That's unreal, mate. Thank you. And what's been some of the impact of the foundation's work here locally in Australia?
Yeah, so, measuring significance is a really dangerous art.
It is.
But we've teamed up with the Centre for Social Impact to try and get what physios and other health professionals would know would be those asterisk signs.
Right.
So that we can measure and retest and make sure our programs are working. Just recently, we heard news that after 8 years of flying practitioners into northeast Arnhem Land, working amongst the first people there, after putting in funding, grant after grant to the government to try and show efficacy for the work that we're doing, that they have finally seen proof of concept in a lot of our programming. And so that's exciting news because it means we're starting to get cut through. At a macro level, how do you close the gap on healthcare in Indigenous people? That's a very complex subject. But at a personal level, there are stories and anecdotes of individual lives who are being changed. We think knee pain and back pain and eating healthy and just moving well are obvious and intuitive to people. The truth is, Jack, some of these Indigenous families are hearing about this for the first time.
Wow.
And they're lifestyle diseases in these communities. It's all about actually preventable disease, diabetes and chronic pain, and a lot of these things that we manage, they're all preventable. And so helping them just make better decisions every day are some of the impacts that we're looking to measure.
It's fantastic, mate. And I love that it's not just a token generosity or we're going to do something because we think it's right to do, but there's efficacy behind it and research. That's fantastic. And of course, we do things to make an impact for the people we help. I'm fascinated that as we do good as an organisation, so it does good for us also. What's been the impact of the foundation on your Back in Motion team themselves, those who are giving, going? What's been that impact?
Yeah, it's profound, I think, because it shapes the culture of who we are. And interestingly, just so that there's no confusion, half of the volunteers now who get behind our foundation are not Back in Motion staff, which is just wonderful.
Unreal.
So we have broadened the reach to the whole industry, the Australian Physio Association, the Australian Podiatry Group, the Occupational Therapy Peak Body. They're all behind us and helping in lots of different ways. And so the reach is much broader. This is not so much a Back in Motion initiative anymore, as it much, it's got its own identity. But it does change you. You think you go all that way on a plane to go help some other people, and you realise that they often give more back to you than you've given out. And that's because they have unique perspective on life. They see the world very simply in some respects, and they shame us in the complexity that we add to our world.
Right.
But one of the big attractions when we started the foundation was to expose middle-class suburban health practitioners to the plight of the poor, but also to let them experience for themselves that contradiction in life, and so that they would be internally provoked to live their life differently. And we've got lots of stories of well-to-do, in this lucky country, health practitioners who come home and they do really think and talk differently, and they're committed now to helping in ways far beyond our foundation might be able to support, which is wonderful.
That's so good. If I can press a little bit deeper on this issue, though, I'm really personally challenged. I've been on a number of these called a mission trip or insight trip, opportunity to give, and that profoundly changed my life. And I know that it does for so many hundreds and thousands of others who go and see and come back changed. Is there anything that you guys do to combat or avoid the plight of poverty tourism and just going, seeing, and ending up doing more harm than good, but ticking the God complex in ourselves? How do we ensure that we don't do more harm than good by going and seeing?
Yeah. Poverty tourism is a thing. It's a real thing. In fact, only 2 weeks ago, we ran our first ever exposure trip to Palm Island. And by exposure trip, what I mean is we took 3 or 4 either high net worth individuals or people of influence within our sector, because we wanted them to see firsthand our programs and just life in these communities. And I've been so nervous to run an exposure trip because I don't want people to feel like they're on show.
Right.
And so actually all of our trips are health outreach missions up until recently. And everyone who goes on the trip has to do something. We have to contribute. But I think that the really big learning for us to guard our heart, to make sure we're not just spruiking these people's disadvantage for anything other than their good, is to make sure that when we land in these communities, Jack, that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we use them in that proportion. And by that, I mean we are big learners. We are big listeners. We need to stop. We need to slow down, and we need to hear their stories, because the help as we know it, the help that we want to give ordinarily can't be applied the way we want to do it. It has to be contextualized for their community. Healthcare needs to have its own flavor in these communities, and they need to teach us how we can help them. So it really is about avoiding the, what did you call it? The God complex or the white knight phenomena, thinking we can just ride in and save the day. It's not about that at all. It's about coming in and learning, hearing, and then shaping the way our programs work with them as the local leaders.
That's unreal, mate. Thank you for sharing. That's a really good insight. And as we are mindful of your time, and as we land this plane, what's been the big difference in leadership from leading a for-profit franchise to leading a dare I say, a smaller scale, not for profit? What's the difference in leadership?
There's a lot of distinctives that separate those two organisational models, and we can laugh and joke about some of them. For instance, the big one at Back in Motion is I get to dangle a paycheck in front of people to compel them to stay on mission and fulfil their commitments. Whereas in a grassroots, not-for-profit, we're all volunteers, very few people are paid, and so I don't have money as leverage. So, that's a very different mechanism to try and motivate people to do what you want them to do. So there's lots of distinctives. But you know what? To be honest, there are far more similarities than I think there are differences. And I think the similarities still come back to you don't want to work for money or profit, and you don't want to work for purpose or, in a voluntary organisation. If in either case, you don't want to be in those teams or in those organisations unless you feel convicted that is your best contribution to the world around you. And so, interestingly, that is the thing that is the same in both. And so, regardless of which team I lead, I'm mostly just interested, do you want to be here? Is this what you're good at? Do you believe in what we're doing? And then the differences fall away.
Incredible, mate. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm so inspired by your ability to build a clinic for good and make such a massive difference in the lives of practitioners, local communities, and across Australia and the globe. So thank you for your generosity. I love your story of faith and of humility, and by no stretch is anyone perfect, yourself and myself included. But thank you so much for sharing your journey here on the podcast. And I know that we can read a lot more about it in your book and through your website. So can you point us in the direction of where people can find out more about your story?
Sure. Anything to do with any of the projects that I've spoken about today, you can track them all down through my personal site, which is jasontsmith.com.au. If you specifically just want to hear about the foundation, they've got their own site, soshealth.org.au. And no one will have trouble tracking down the Back in Motion website, which is backinmotion.com.au. All books are at major retailers and all the good online stores.
Awesome, mate. Thank you so much. And listeners, we will link up all of those links for you on this podcast episode page over at clinicmastery.com/podcast. Everything will be there for you. Jason, thank you so much again. It's been an absolute honour and privilege to host you on the Grow Your Clinic podcast. Listeners, we look forward to bringing you another episode again really soon. Bye for now.
This is the Grow My Clinic podcast by Clinic Mastery, where we help you deliver amazing client experiences to grow your clinic.